All right, welcome to another episode of Mike's Sword Hospital. I was gone for about a week traveling across the country, and while I was absent, not one but two swords showed up on my doorstep. For those of you who haven't seen the prior episodes, let me recap the arrangement I have with Shewan at Murasame. We've got it set up so that he sends any in-country returns to me. Now, if they're still in new condition, resellable, we wait for another buyer and then I ship it out for him. And that's a whole lot less expensive than the shipping back and forth to China, especially if it's going back and forth multiple times. Now, if it turns out the sword is flawed, damaged, not resellable, I get to keep it and hopefully work my magic on repairing, restoring it. But in either case, we have a sword to review. So let's start today with the less expensive of the pair. This is currently going for $215 US on Amazon. As always, I'll put the link down in the description below. This is a clay-tempered T10 Shinogi Zukiri with Bohi that's described as having a yellow dragon theme. So we'll look at the specs, my impressions of the sword and the build quality, and answer the question, why was it returned? Okay, let's start with the damage report. Why was the sword returned? Well, on Shewan's account page, the reason given was no longer wanted. Need a second? It's sad. Okay. But apparently the buyer did have it for about a week or two. And when I got it, it was in its original styrofoam box, but it was not in its protective plastic wrap or in its sword bag. The sword bag was rolled up neatly and just stuck in the box with it. So on examination, there were signs that the buyer had used it to do some cutting with, probably plastic bottles, because there was still the telltale residue on the blade. I'll put up a picture that hadn't been removed completely and resulted in some staining by the time I got it. Now, Shewan suggested I do a video on corrosion prevention, and while I'm at it, I'll probably talk about how to deal with corrosion when you get it on these reproduction swords. Sounds like an awesome idea, so keep your eyes open for that episode to come. But otherwise, yes, I did manage to get the staining off. I can talk about that process in that future video. And there's no damage to the edge. It's not a terribly meaty edge, but it did pass what I call my fragile edge tests, which I'll talk about in future videos. Doesn't appear to be any other damage to the sword. I did a disassembly to check. However, the saya, again, it came to me no longer in its sword bag, just in the box. So I don't know if this happened on the way to the buyer while the buyer had it or on the way back to me. If you happen to be the buyer, let me know, because this is useful information. But it's a pretty burl finish, probably why it's called the Yellow Dragon, on an otherwise simple, basic wooden saya. Don't think this is the actual pattern of the wood. I think this is just a surface treatment. No horn fixtures or anything like that, but it does have the nice Sageo, not just the leftover Ito. So that's a good upgrade. But down here towards the bottom, there is indeed a fairly sizable split in the seam with some wood missing, splintered out, and then that crack goes across the side of the saya. I don't know if I'm going to be able to repair this without having to refinish the whole thing, which means this pretty finish goes away. To be continued. But otherwise, the sword itself is in great shape. Let's take a look at fit, finish, build quality, and handling. All right, let's talk about the specs real quick before we get into fit, finish, build quality, and handling. And I'm going to be looking down at my notes so I can give you the metric as well as the imperial units, starting with the blade length, which is in the expected range for a lot of Shewan reproduction Uchi Katana. This one is 27.5 inches or 70 centimeters as measured from the Habaki. Distal taper goes from 7 millimeters down to 4. Suka length 11 inches, so 28 centimeters. Now weight, despite having a bohi to reduce weight, surprisingly 2 pounds 7 ounces, 1,105 grams. And I think a lot of that is because of all of the metal down here in these brass fittings. Gives it a point of balance 3.5 inches from the habaki, so closer to the hand, about 8.9 centimeters. Lets it feel in hand a little bit lighter than it is. In my tip score system, it's rating 7.6. Given my dividing line of a score of 8, anything slightly above that feels a little heavier in the hand, more blade presence authority for heavy cutting, versus anything slightly below an 8 feels a little bit lighter, nimbler, more maneuverable. Yeah, this feels just a little bit lighter. Again, lighter than how much it actually weighs. All right, we'll talk about that more in handling, but let's get on to fit, finish, build quality, value for the money. All right, let's talk about fit, finish, and build quality, and we'll start with the cracked saya, which again, basic wooden saya, but despite being a basic wooden saya and being cracked, the fit's still pretty good. Lock up at the koiguchi is pretty nice. Not too tight, not too loose. And the draw stroke is fairly smooth. Despite being cracked, not a lot of rattle in there. You do get the nicer sageo, so that's kind of an upgrade. Now, I did mention already that the width front to back of the suka at the top is a bit wider than I'm used to. What that creates is a nice symmetry between the fuchi and the koiguchi. So if that's something that appeals to you in design, this sword has it. Also, the suka does have a nice taper and waist to it. It's subtle, but it's there. Now, when it comes to transitions between the fuchi, the kashira, and the ito, yeah, there's a little bit of a shelf there, but not much. But because these are solid brass fittings, they are, shall we say, malleable. And I do plan on doing a video on how to alter the fit of these parts on a sword if you receive one that, well, maybe a little out of line. It is fixable. Talk about that in the future. Now, casting quality is not the greatest. In some places, it's pretty attractive. I feel like this kashira is on upside down, that when the sword is sheathed and worn edge up, the dragon face is upside down. I feel like it should be the other way, but that's just me. However, since there's not a lot of detail around the sides here, it looks kind of unfinished. The fuchi, there are no seams left, but in removing those seams, there are some places where that engraving pattern is just not really there anymore. But again, this being brass, I could re-engrave it myself. To be continued, and again, something we might talk about in a future video. Dragon Manuki, they're pretty nice. Real same panels, but one of the things I talked about in rewrapping a suka is they at least went to the trouble of beveling the edges of the panels so it's not leaving any glaring shelves visible through the ito. There's some, but it's not too bad. Not really blocky and square looking. Speaking of the ito, not the most perfect diamonds, no sign of any hishigami or anything like that, not at this price point. But it's nice and tight. It's not going anywhere. Double pin construction, a full-length tang. I'll show you a picture of it disassembled. There's nothing fancy, but it's solid. I had no trouble getting it apart and putting it back together. Refer to my video on stuck suka on these reproductions. Didn't really run into those problems. Everything nice and tight. No sign of cracking or anything in the suka core. Nothing fancy in the seppa. The suba continues the dragon theme. It's pretty thoroughly detailed. Got lots of stuff going on here. However, again, unevenness in the casting quality at this price point. Around the side where the casting seam is. Some places it's been smoothed off, and in other places, yeah, there's a glaring transition where you can see that casting seam. But yeah, being solid brass, I could fix that myself with a little attention, some files, sandpaper, Again, something I might cover in a future video. Habaki. Nothing fancy, but in this case I really like the simplicity of the smoothness and the curves. Fit is good, and like I said, lockup is just fine. Blade. T10 clay tempered, not the boldest Timon, and yeah, it is a little bit more faded than when it came to me because I had to do some repolishing to get some corrosion off. I could bring it back out with a mild acid solution if I wanted to. But this is a machine polish. It's very even, but not fancy. The yokote, it's well done, but yeah, it's cosmetic. Bohi are pretty well done. They're not very deep, so it doesn't remove a lot of steel and weight from the blade. But we'll talk about that when we talk about, okay, how does it handle? All right. One thing I like to do is listen to the sound of the draw stroke to give me a sense of the quality of the inside of a saya. Not bad. A little bit of, shall we say, a soft rattle, and you might hear some ring off the sword itself. But we're talking about a basic no-frills wooden saya with a crack in it. Speaking of which, lockup, not too tight, not too loose. Not the smoothest tool, but for 200 bucks, a pretty functional and reasonably comfortable one. Speaking of comfort, I was a little worried about the width of the fuchi, this end of the suka, front to back. And measuring it, we're talking 3 to 5 millimeters wider this way than my other swords. Similar to that Hanwei Golden Oriole, but I think it makes up for that by being narrower this way. So not an axe handle, not a baseball bat. And this geometry might actually make it easier to index your edge. Definitely feel where this blade is pointing. So very comfortable in the hand, no significant hot spots, everything's staying put, nothing's moving that shouldn't be moving. So that's all good. Now weight for a blade like this with a full bohi, I would expect it to be a bit lighter, but weight distribution with all the metal down here, it doesn't feel unwieldy. Now one-handed, I can move it around. I definitely feel the weight. So I'm getting a workout out of it, but it's not a crowbar. Two-handed, yeah, it definitely moves. So that's really nice while still feeling like it's got good blade presence, authority for cutting. So in that sense, it might be a good all-around tool for both kata and cutting practice, depending on how you train. Now, getting back to that price point. If you'd like me to do a video on my current recommendations for budget swords, let me know. I'll put it on the to-do list. But if I was looking for something between $200 and $250 US, yeah, I'd probably see what Murasame had in stock, because I'd be confident I'd be getting pretty good usable blade, pretty tight build, and in this case, good quality fixtures. I mean, usually at this price point, you'd be getting cheap painted die cast pieces, and these are solid brass. So that's fantastic. So I think value for the money is really good, despite the little crack in the saya, however that happened. But yeah, otherwise, kind of impressed with it for what it is. All right, so let's get our conversation going in the comments as usual. If you have any questions about this sword, if you have other Murasame products, let me know what your experiences have been like. Any other topics you might want me to cover in future videos. All that input is extremely inspiring. I do have trouble coming up with ideas on my own. But until next time, thanks as always for watching, following my journey, subscribing to the channel, sharing the videos, liking the videos, adding to our conversation. And I hope to see you back for the next episode, because we have shiny.